The tapestry of Tamriel's history stretches across millennia, woven with the deeds of emperors and the machinations of gods. Yet for every legendary figure whose name echoes through the halls of time, countless others have faded into obscurity, their contributions buried beneath the weight of ages. These forgotten heroes walked the same paths as the great champions of law, faced trials that would break lesser souls, and shaped the very foundations of the world we know today. Tonight, we journey beyond the familiar tales of Tiber Septim's conquests and the Nerevarene's triumph. We delve into the shadowed corners of history, where unsung champions wielded blade and spell against impossible odds. These are the stories that the bards rarely sing, the chronicles that gather dust in forgotten archives, the legends that time itself seems determined to erase. In the depths of ancient libraries, scholars occasionally uncover fragments of these lost narratives. A weathered journal here, a crumbling stone tablet there, each piece revealing glimpses of heroes whose names once commanded respect across the provinces. Their deeds were no less remarkable than those we celebrate, their sacrifices no less meaningful, their courage no less inspiring. Yet somehow, through the cruel mechanics of time and the selective nature of memory, they have been relegated to footnotes in the grand chronicle of Tamriel. What makes a hero worthy of remembrance? Is it the magnitude of their deeds, the scope of their influence, or simply the luck of having chroniclers who survive to tell their tale? The forgotten heroes of Tamriel challenge our understanding of legacy itself. They remind us that history is not merely the recording of events, but the curation of memory, shaped by the biases and limitations of those who write it. The earliest of these lost champions emerged during the Dawn era, when the boundaries between myth and reality remained fluid. In those primordial times, when the Aedra still walked among mortals and the laws of nature bent to divine will, heroes arose not from noble bloodlines or grand prophecies, but from the simple necessity of survival. They face threats that modern scholars struggle to comprehend, wielding powers that have since been lost to the world. Consider the tale of Vethrana, the Twilight Walker, a Chimera mystic whose name appears in only the most ancient texts. During the early settlement of Morrowind, when the Dwemer still delved deep beneath the earth and the Nordic raids threatened the eastern shores, Vethrana walked between the realms of dream and waking. Her unique gift allowed her to enter the sleeping minds of enemies, turning their own nightmares against them. Entire war parties would flee in terror after encountering her, their leaders driven mad by visions that followed them into the waking world. The few surviving accounts describe her as a solitary figure, cloaked in twilight mists that seemed to emanate from her very being. She required no army, no grand strategies, no political maneuvering. Her weapon was the mind itself, her battlefield the landscape of dreams and fears. Yet for all her power, Vethrana vanished from history as mysteriously as she had appeared, leaving behind only scattered references and the whispered fears of those who had faced her otherworldly abilities. In the western reaches of High Rock, during the chaotic period before the formation of the Daggerfall Covenant, another forgotten champion emerged from the political turmoil. Sir Aldric Ravencrest, a Breton knight whose tactical brilliance rivaled that of any general in recorded history, united the fractured city-states through a combination of military prowess and diplomatic cunning that would make even the most skilled politicians envious. Unlike the traditional knights of his era, Ravencrest understood that true strength lay not in individual combat prowess, but in the ability to forge unlikely alliances and turn enemies into allies. His campaigns were masterclasses in psychological warfare, where the mere threat of his involvement could end conflicts before they began. He pioneered tactics that would later be adopted by imperial legions, developed siege techniques that revolutionized warfare, and created a network of spies and informants that stretched across the province. The chronicles speak of his final battle, where he faced overwhelming odds defending a small mining town against a horde of orc raiders. Outnumbered 10-1, Ravencrest employed every trick in his considerable arsenal. He turned the town's mineshafts into a maze of traps and ambushes, used the local geography to fragment the enemy forces, and inspired the townspeople to fight with a courage they never knew they possessed. The battle lasted 3 days, and when the dust finally settled, the orc horde had been shattered, their survivors fleeing back to the Hrothgarian mountains. Yet Ravencrest himself was found among the fallen, his body bearing the wounds of a dozen different weapons. The townspeople erected a monument in his honor, but within a generation, the monument had crumbled, the town had been abandoned, and the knight's name had faded from memory. Only the tactical manuals he wrote, copied and recopied by military scholars, preserve any trace of his genius. The forests of Valenwood hide their own forgotten legends, champions who defended the ancient ways against the encroachment of civilization. Among these woodland guardians, none was more formidable than Sylvanas the Root Speaker, a Bosmer druid whose connection to the green transcended anything recorded in modern times. In an era when the Cameron dynasty was consolidating power and the old tribal ways were being swept aside, Sylvanas stood as a bridge between the ancient forest wisdom and the new political realities. His abilities defied conventional understanding of magic. Where typical druids might coax trees to grow or commune with woodland creatures, Sylvanas could reshape entire forests with a thought. He could cause the very ground to shift and change, creating impassable barriers or hidden pathways as the situation demanded. Ancient oaks would uproot themselves at his command, walking like massive sentinels to defend sacred groves. The forest itself became his weapon, his shield, and his sanctuary. The few surviving accounts describe battles where Sylvanas single-handedly turned back entire armies, not through violence, but through the sheer, overwhelming power of nature itself. Invading forces would find their supply lines cut off as rivers changed course overnight, their campsites swallowed by suddenly appearing sinkholes, their weapons rendered useless as metal, corroded with impossible speed. Yet despite his incredible power, Sylvanas never sought to rule or to impose his will upon others. He simply protected what he loved, asking nothing in return but to be left in peace. The end of his story remains shrouded in mystery. Some say he simply walked deeper into the forest one day and never returned, becoming one with the green he had served so faithfully. Others claim he transformed into one of the great trees that still stand in the deepest parts of Valenwood, watching over the forest with eternal vigilance. Whatever his fate, the forests he protected continue to thrive, their ancient magic intact, though few remember the guardian who made such preservation possible. In the harsh landscapes of Skyrim, where survival depends on strength and cunning in equal measure, the forgotten heroes often emerged from the most unlikely circumstances. Such was the case with Thora Ironwill, a Nord woman whose rise from slavery to legendary status represents one of the most remarkable transformations in Nordic history. Born into bondage during the early days of the First Empire, Thora's early life was marked by hardship and suffering that would have broken most souls. The slave markets of ancient Skyrim were brutal institutions, where human beings were bought and sold like livestock. Thora endured years of backbreaking labor in the mines beneath Markarth, her spirit seemingly crushed by the endless cycle of toil and punishment. Yet within her burned a fire that no amount of suffering could extinguish. She began to organize her fellow slaves, teaching them to read and write in secret, sharing what little food she could spare, and most importantly, nurturing the hope that freedom was possible. The slave rebellion she eventually led was unlike anything Skyrim had seen before. Rather than the desperate, chaotic uprising that most slave revolts became, Thora's rebellion was a carefully orchestrated campaign that combined military strategy with psychological warfare. She had spent years studying her captors, learning their weaknesses, mapping their supply routes, and identifying potential allies among the free population. When the rebellion finally began, it spread like wildfire across the province, as slaves throughout Skyrim rose up in coordinated strikes against their oppressors. The former slave proved to be a brilliant military commander, turning ragtag groups of escaped slaves into disciplined fighting forces. She understood that victory required more than just military success. It demanded the complete transformation of Nordic society. Her forces not only fought battles, but also provided food and shelter to escaped slaves, established schools and hospitals, and created a functioning government that could serve as an alternative to the existing order. The war lasted 7 years, during which Thora's reputation grew to legendary proportions. She was said to possess an uncanny ability to inspire courage in her followers, to see through enemy deceptions, and to appear wherever the fighting was fiercest. Her tactical innovations, particularly her use of guerrilla warfare in Skyrim's mountainous terrain, would influence military thinking for generations to come. Yet despite her military genius, Thora never lost sight of her ultimate goal. Not just freedom for herself and her followers, but the complete abolition of slavery throughout Skyrim. The conflict finally ended, not with a climactic battle, but with a negotiated settlement that saw the formal abolition of slavery and the integration of former slaves into Nordic society as full citizens. Thora herself was offered a position as a jarl, with lands and titles befitting her accomplishments. Yet she refused, choosing instead to return to the mountains where she had first learned to fight, dedicating her remaining years to ensuring that the hard-won freedoms would never be lost again. These forgotten heroes share common threads that bind their stories together across time and province. They emerged not from privilege or prophecy, but from necessity and circumstance. They faced impossible odds with courage born of desperation and hope. They achieved victories that seemed beyond mortal capability, yet asked for nothing in return but the chance to protect what they held dear. And ultimately, they faded from memory, not because their deeds were less worthy, but because history is written by those who survive to tell the tale. The mechanisms by which heroes are remembered or forgotten reveal much about the nature of legacy itself. Political considerations, cultural biases, and the simple passage of time all play roles in determining which stories survive and which fade away. The forgotten heroes of Tamriel remind us that greatness is not always rewarded with remembrance, and that the most profound acts of courage often go unrecognized by posterity. Yet these lost champions left their mark upon the world in ways that transcend the written word. Their influence flows through the bloodlines of their descendants, echoes in the customs they established, and lives on in the institutions they created. Though their names may be forgotten, their legacy endures in the very fabric of Tamrielic civilization. The ancient libraries of the Crystal Tower once housed the most complete collection of historical records in all of Tamriel. Among these dusty tomes and crumbling scrolls, scholars occasionally discovered references to heroes whose deeds had been deliberately erased from mainstream histories. Political purges, religious reformations, and cultural upheavals all contributed to the systematic removal of inconvenient truths from the official record. Yet fragments survived, hidden in marginalia, preserved in private correspondence, or encoded in seemingly innocent poems and songs. One such fragment tells of Kaelin Dawnwhisper, an Altmer sorceress whose mastery of temporal magic allowed her to witness events across multiple timelines simultaneously. During the chaotic period following the fall of the Aeliad Empire, when refugees fleeing the Alessian uprising sought sanctuary in the Somerset Isles, Kaelin used her unique abilities to guide her people through the labyrinth of possible futures that lay before them. Her gift came at a terrible cost. To perceive multiple timelines meant experiencing the deaths of loved ones countless times over, witnessing the rise and fall of civilizations in endless variation, and bearing the weight of knowledge that no single mind was meant to contain. The constant bombardment of temporal visions gradually eroded her sanity, yet she persevered, using her fractured perspective to steer the Altmer away from the darkest possible outcomes. The chronicles describe her as a tragic figure, beloved by her people yet increasingly isolated by the burden of her abilities. She would speak of conversations with individuals who had died years earlier, reference events that had occurred in alternate timelines, and weep for tragedies that had never come to pass in the current reality. Yet her guidance proved invaluable, helping the Altmen navigate the political complexities of their new circumstances and avoid the mistakes that had led to the downfall of their Ayleid cousins. Her final act was perhaps her most selfless. When she foresaw a timeline where her own continued existence would lead to catastrophic consequences for her people, Kaelin chose to sacrifice herself, using her temporal abilities to ensure that the destructive future would never come to pass. She simply vanished one morning, leaving behind only a cryptic note explaining that her work was complete and that her people would be safe. The exact nature of the threat she averted remains unknown, but the Altmer prospered in the centuries that followed, their society growing stronger and more stable than it had ever been. In the swamplands of Black Marsh, where the histories whisper secrets older than mortal memory, another forgotten champion emerged during the early days of the Alessian Empire. Scales Like Midnight was an Argonian shadow scale whose loyalty to his people transcended the traditional bonds of the Dark Brotherhood. When Imperial forces began their systematic conquest of the southern provinces, he recognized that conventional warfare would be insufficient to protect his homeland from the expanding empire. Unlike typical shadow scales, who served the Dark Brotherhood's contracts without question, Scales Like Midnight chose to use his lethal skills in service of a greater cause. He became a ghost in the Imperial war machine, eliminating key commanders, sabotaging supply lines, and spreading terror through the ranks of the occupying forces. His methods were so effective that entire legions began to refuse deployment to Black Marsh, preferring court-martial to facing the phantom assassin who struck without warning and vanished without trace. The Imperial response was swift and brutal. They began taking hostages from Argonian settlements, threatening to execute innocent civilians if the Shadow Scale did not surrender. Yet Scales Like Midnight had anticipated this tactic, having studied Imperial military doctrine extensively. He began targeting not just military personnel, but also the Imperial bureaucrats and merchants who profited from the occupation. His message was clear. The cost of holding Black Marsh would be paid in blood, and that blood would flow from the highest levels of Imperial society. The Campaign of Terror lasted nearly a decade, during which Scales Like Midnight became a legend among his people and a nightmare for the Imperial forces. He was said to be able to move through water like a fish, to blend with shadows like smoke, and to kill with poisons so subtle that victims would die days later without ever knowing they had been murdered. The few Imperial soldiers who claimed to have seen him described a figure that seemed more myth than reality, a living shadow that struck from impossible angles and vanished before retaliation was possible. The War of Shadows finally ended, not with the Shadow Scale's death, but with the negotiated withdrawal of Imperial forces from the deepest parts of Black Marsh. The cost of maintaining the occupation had become too high, both in terms of manpower and political capital. Scales Like Midnight had achieved something that conventional armies could not. He had made the conquest of his homeland more trouble than it was worth. Yet his victory came at a personal cost that few could comprehend. Years of living in constant danger, of carrying the weight of his people's survival on his shoulders, had transformed him into something barely recognizable as the person he had once been. The final entries in his journal, discovered decades later in a hidden cache beneath the waters of the Blackwood Swamp, reveal a man haunted by the lives he had taken and the choices he had made. He wrote of dreams filled with the faces of his victims, of a loneliness so profound that it threatened to consume him entirely, and of a growing uncertainty about whether his actions had truly saved his people or merely delayed their inevitable subjugation. The journal ends abruptly, with no indication of what became of the Shadow Scale who had defied an empire and won. The mountainous regions of Hammerfell tell their own tales of forgotten heroes, champions who emerged from the harsh desert wastes to defend their people against threats both foreign and domestic. Among these was Rashida al-Sentinel, a Redguard warrior poet whose mastery of the sword-singing arts surpassed even the legendary masters of her time. Yet her greatest achievement was not in battle, but in the preservation of knowledge that would have otherwise been lost to the sands of time. During the early Second Era, when the Dwemer had recently vanished, and their abandoned cities dotted the landscape like empty shells, Rashida undertook a quest that would consume the better part of her life. She recognized that the Dwemer ruins contained knowledge that could benefit all of Tamriel, but also understood that most of their secrets would be lost forever if not properly preserved. Unlike the treasure hunters and grave robbers who plundered these sites for quick profit, Rashida approached each ruin as a scholar, carefully documenting everything she found and ensuring that the knowledge would be preserved for future generations. Her expeditions into the Dwemer ruins were legendary for their thoroughness and their danger. She would spend months at a time in the deepest parts of these ancient cities, mapping their layouts, copying their inscriptions, and carefully studying their mechanical marvels. The automatons that still guarded these places seemed to recognize her scholarly intent, often allowing her to pass unmolested through areas where other explorers would have been killed on sight. The knowledge she gathered was systematically organized into a comprehensive archive that she established in the city of Sentinel. Her collection included detailed blueprints of Dwemer machinery, translations of their written language, and most importantly, philosophical treatises that revealed the mindset of the vanished race. She understood that the Dwemer had not simply disappeared, but had chosen to transcend their physical existence through means that defied conventional understanding. Her final expedition took her to the ruins of Arkanthams, where she discovered evidence of the Dwemer's last great experiment. The details of what she found there remain classified even today, but her final report to the Redguard court spoke of discoveries that could fundamentally alter the balance of power in Tamriel. She recommended that the information be sealed away, hidden from those who might use it for destructive purposes. The court agreed, and Rashida's archive was dispersed, its contents scattered across multiple secure locations throughout Hammerfell. The warrior poet herself vanished shortly after completing her final report, leaving behind only her sword and a cryptic message about walking the path of the Dwemer. Some believe she discovered the secret of their disappearance and chose to follow them into whatever realm they had ascended to. Others suggest she simply retreated to the deep desert, spending her final years in contemplation of the mysteries she had uncovered. Whatever her fate, the knowledge she preserved continued to influence Redguard society for generations, shaping their understanding of technology, philosophy, and the nature of existence itself. These forgotten heroes remind us that greatness takes many forms, and that the most profound impacts are often achieved through quiet dedication rather than spectacular displays of power. They worked in shadows and silence, motivated not by glory or recognition, but by an unshakable commitment to something greater than themselves. Their stories survive not in grand monuments or epic poems, but in the subtle ways they shaped the world around them, creating ripples that continue to influence events long after their names have been forgotten. The pattern of forgetting is not random, but follows predictable cycles that reflect the values and biases of each era. Heroes who challenge established orders, who represent uncomfortable truths, or who simply lack powerful patrons to preserve their memory, are most likely to fade from history. Yet their erasure from the official record does not diminish the reality of their contributions, or the significance of their achievements. In the frozen wastelands beyond Skyrim's northern borders, where the aurora dances across endless fields of ice and snow, there once walked a figure whose very existence challenged the fundamental understanding of life and death. Jorun the Deathless was neither truly alive nor completely dead, but something far more complex, a guardian caught between realms, tasked with maintaining the delicate balance that kept the world of the living separate from the realm of the departed. The circumstances of his transformation remain shrouded in mystery, known only through fragments of ancient Nordic poetry that speak of a great warrior who made the ultimate sacrifice to prevent an invasion from beyond the veil of death. During the late Merethic era, when the dragons still ruled the skies and the first human settlements clung precariously to existence, a catastrophic ritual performed by desperate necromancers threatened to tear open a permanent gateway between Mundus and the realm of the dead. The ritual required a willing soul of extraordinary strength to serve as an anchor, someone who could hold the gateway closed through sheer force of will. Joran stepped forward, knowing full well that accepting this burden would trap him in a state of perpetual existence, neither fully alive nor able to find peace in death. The transformation was excruciating, his mortal flesh becoming something else entirely. A vessel capable of containing energies that would destroy any ordinary being. For countless centuries, Joran wandered the northernmost reaches of Tamriel, his presence alone sufficient to keep the supernatural forces at bay. He appeared as a tall figure wrapped in funeral shrouds that seemed to move with their own will, his face hidden beneath a hood that cast shadows deeper than any natural darkness. Those few who encountered him spoke of eyes that held the weight of eternity, a gaze that seemed to see through the present moment into the vast expanse of time itself. His vigil was a lonely one, marked by encounters with spirits, wraiths, and other entities that sought to breach the boundary between life and death. Each confrontation drained a portion of his essence, yet he persevered, understanding that his sacrifice protected not just the living, but the natural order itself. The dead deserved their rest, and the living deserved to remain unburdened by the constant presence of those who had passed beyond the veil. The few records that mention Joran describe him as a figure of profound melancholy, aware that his sacrifice would never be fully understood or appreciated by those he protected. He left behind a series of stone markers scattered across the northern wilderness, each one inscribed with warnings about the dangers that lurked beyond the boundaries of the mortal world. These markers still stand today, though their true purpose has been forgotten, dismissed by modern scholars as primitive superstitions, rather than the vital warnings they truly represent. His final fate remains unknown, though some believe he still walks the frozen wastes, his eternal vigil continuing even as the world changes around him. The aurora that dances across the northern skies is said by some to be a reflection of his presence, a visual manifestation of the barrier he maintains between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Whether this is truth or merely poetic interpretation matters little. The fact remains that no major incursion from beyond the veil has threatened Tamriel since his sacrifice, a testament to the effectiveness of his eternal watch. The eastern provinces of Morrowind hide their own forgotten champions, individuals whose contributions to Dunmer society have been overshadowed by the more famous exploits of the Tribunal and their chosen champions. Among these was Serana Dress, a Dunmer noble whose mastery of the forbidden arts of soul manipulation allowed her to achieve feats that bordered on the miraculous. Yet her greatest accomplishment was not in the realm of magic, but in the transformation of Dunmer attitudes towards slavery and social hierarchy. Born into one of the great houses during the height of the Tribunal's power, Serana witnessed firsthand the brutal realities of Dunmer society. The systematic oppression of the Argonian and Khajiit slaves troubled her deeply. Yet she understood that direct confrontation with the established order would accomplish nothing beyond her own destruction. Instead, she chose a more subtle approach, using her considerable magical abilities to gradually undermine the foundations of the slave trade from within. Her technique involved the careful manipulation of souls, not to destroy or enslave them, but to awaken them to their full potential. She would visit the slave markets under the guise of making purchases, but instead of acquiring property, she would perform subtle enchantments that enhanced the intelligence, awareness, and magical abilities of those she encountered. The changes were gradual enough to avoid detection, but profound enough to fundamentally alter the balance of power between masters and slaves. the effects of her interventions began to manifest within a generation. Slaves who had been considered little more than beasts of burden began to display remarkable intelligence and ingenuity. They organized themselves into informal networks, sharing knowledge and resources in ways that their masters had never imagined possible. Some even began to manifest magical abilities, a development that shocked and terrified the Dunmer nobility, who had always assumed that their magical superiority was a matter of racial destiny rather than circumstance. Serana's activities did not go entirely unnoticed. The Morag Tong, ever vigilant for threats to the established order, began to investigate the unusual developments in the slave population. Yet their inquiries led nowhere, as Serana had been careful to cover her tracks and to work through intermediaries who were unaware of her true purpose. She maintained her facade as a conventional noble, attending the proper social functions and expressing the appropriate opinions, all while secretly orchestrating the gradual transformation of Dunmer society. The culmination of her efforts came during a slave uprising that differed dramatically from the typical, brutal and ultimately futile rebellions of the past. This uprising was coordinated, intelligent, and remarkably effective. The slaves demonstrated tactical acumen that rivaled that of trained soldiers, employed magical abilities that their masters had never suspected they possessed, and showed a level of organization that made suppression nearly impossible. The uprising succeeded not through violence, but through the simple demonstration that the slaves were every bit as capable as their masters when given the opportunity to prove themselves. Faced with this undeniable evidence, many Dunmer nobles began to question the fundamental assumptions upon which their society was built. The process of social transformation was slow and often painful, but it was ultimately irreversible. Serana herself never lived to see the full fruits of her labor. She died under mysterious circumstances, her body found in her private chambers with no obvious signs of violence. Some suspected assassination by those who opposed her reforms, while others believed she had simply exhausted herself through the enormous magical efforts required to maintain her secret activities. Her personal effects revealed little about her true work, as she had been careful to destroy any evidence that might compromise her network of allies and co-conspirators. The legacy of her efforts lived on in the gradual but steady improvement in the treatment of slaves throughout Morrowind. While the institution of slavery persisted for centuries after her death, the absolute brutality that had once characterized it began to diminish. Slaves were increasingly viewed as valuable assets rather than expendable property, and some even achieved positions of considerable influence within Dunmer society. The transformation was so gradual that most people never recognized its artificial nature, attributing it instead to the natural evolution of social attitudes. In the merchant cities of elsewhere, where the sugar trade created vast fortunes and equally vast inequalities, another forgotten hero emerged to challenge the established order. Darjan the Moonwalker was a Khajiit whose unique abilities allowed him to traverse the boundary between the physical and spiritual realms, a gift that he used to expose the corruption and injustice that plagued his homeland. The sugar trade had created a society where a small elite lived in unprecedented luxury, while the majority of the population struggled in poverty. The wealthy merchants who controlled the trade had corrupted the traditional clan structures, using their influence to manipulate the legal system and ensure that their crimes went unpunished. Darjan recognized that conventional methods of reform would be ineffective against such entrenched corruption, and so he chose to wage his campaign through supernatural means. His ability to walk between realms allowed him to observe events that others could not see, to witness conversations that took place in supposedly secure locations, and to gather evidence that would have been impossible to obtain through normal means. He used this information to expose the crimes of the merchant elite, but he did so in ways that appeared to be divine intervention rather than the work of any mortal agent. Corrupt officials would find themselves plagued by nightmares that revealed their victims' suffering. Merchants who cheated their workers would discover that their ledgers had been mysteriously altered to record their true profits rather than the falsified amounts they reported to the authorities. Most dramatically, those who had committed the most heinous crimes would find themselves confronted by the spirits of their victims, manifestations that only they could see, but which terrified them beyond rational thought. The campaign of supernatural justice created a climate of fear among the corrupt elite, but it also inspired hope among the oppressed. Stories spread of the Moonwalker's interventions, tales that grew in the telling, but which always contained kernels of truth. The poor began to believe that their suffering was not invisible, that justice would eventually prevail, and that those who abused their power would ultimately be held accountable for their actions. Darjan's methods were not without controversy. Some argued that his supernatural interventions violated the natural order, that justice achieved through spiritual manipulation was no justice at all. Others questioned whether any individual had the right to serve as judge and jury, regardless of the righteousness of their cause. These debates raged in the scholarly circles of elsewhere, but among the common people, there was little doubt about the Moonwalker's value. The merchant elite eventually organized a response to the supernatural threat they faced. They hired mages and priests to protect them from spiritual intervention, established new security measures to prevent the gathering of evidence, and even attempted to track down the Moonwalker himself. Yet Darjan proved to be as elusive as the moonbeams from which he took his name, always seeming to stay one step ahead of those who sought to capture him. His final act was perhaps his most audacious. During a grand festival attended by all the major merchant families, Darjan manifested simultaneously in multiple locations, appearing to dozens of witnesses at once. He spoke to each corrupt official individually, revealing their crimes in detail and warning them that their time of reckoning had arrived. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he vanished, leaving behind only a series of documents that provided irrefutable proof of the corruption that had plagued elsewhere for generations. The revelations that followed transformed Khajiit society. The merchant elite found themselves facing not just popular uprising but legal prosecution based on the evidence the Moonwalker had provided. Many fled the province, taking their ill-gotten wealth with them, while others faced justice in the traditional courts. The power structures that had seemed so permanent began to crumble, replaced by systems that were more responsive to the needs of the common people. Darjan himself was never seen again after that final manifestation. Some believe he simply returned to the spiritual realm from which he had emerged, his work complete. Others suggest that he continued his activities in other provinces, fighting corruption and injustice wherever he found them. The truth may never be known, but the impact of his interventions continued to shape Khajiit society for generations, creating a legacy of justice that outlasted the man who had made it possible. These forgotten heroes of Tamriel shared certain common characteristics that transcended their individual circumstances and cultural backgrounds. They emerged from situations where conventional solutions had failed, where the established order seemed too powerful to challenge through normal means. They possessed abilities that set them apart from their contemporaries, whether through magical gifts, exceptional intelligence, or simply an unshakable commitment to justice that allowed them to persist where others would have given up. Most importantly, they understood that true change often required sacrifice, that the price of meaningful reform was often paid by those who initiated it, rather than those who ultimately benefited from it. They worked in shadows and silence, motivated not by personal glory but by an unshakable belief that their actions could make the world a better place. Their stories remind us that heroism takes many forms, and that the most profound impacts are often achieved by those who ask for nothing in return, but the satisfaction of knowing they have made a difference. The mechanisms by which these heroes have been forgotten reveal much about the nature of historical memory itself. Political upheavals, religious transformations, and cultural shifts all contribute to the selective preservation of some stories, while others fade into obscurity. Yet their absence from the official record does not diminish the reality of their contributions or the significance of their achievements. They live on in the subtle ways they shaped the world around them, creating ripples that continue to influence events long after their names have been lost to time. The forgotten heroes of Tamriel were not merely individuals who achieved greatness despite obscurity, but rather catalysts who fundamentally altered the trajectory of history through actions that seemed insignificant at the time. Their stories challenge our understanding of influence itself, revealing how the most profound changes often occur through subtle interventions rather than dramatic proclamations. In the scholarly halls of the Arcane University, researchers have occasionally stumbled upon documents that hint at coordinated efforts among these forgotten champions. References to secret gatherings, coded correspondence, and shared resources suggest that some of these heroes were not isolated figures, but part of a larger network dedicated to protecting Tamriel from threats that conventional authorities could neither recognize nor address. The most compelling evidence comes from a series of identical symbols found carved into ruins across multiple provinces, each dating to different historical periods, yet sharing distinctive characteristics that suggest a common origin. These symbols appear in locations where forgotten heroes are known to have operated, leading some scholars to theorize that they mark safe houses, supply caches, or meeting points used by an underground network that spanned centuries. The symbol itself defies easy interpretation. It resembles a stylized tree with roots that extend deeper than its branches reach high, surrounded by a circle that appears to be broken in precisely the same place, regardless of who carved it. The consistency of this design across such vast distances and time periods suggests either remarkable coordination or the existence of an organization that maintained its traditions with extraordinary fidelity. Dr. Aurain Draconis of the Imperial Geographic Society has spent decades studying these symbols and the sites where they appear. Her research indicates that they often mark locations where significant historical events occurred, yet these events are rarely recorded in official histories. A symbol carved into a cliff face near Riften marks the spot where a plague that could have devastated northern Tamriel was mysteriously contained. Another, found in the ruins of an ancient watchtower in Hammerfell, corresponds to the location where a Dwemer artifact of immense destructive potential simply vanished from recorded history. The pattern suggests that these forgotten heroes were not random individuals who happened to achieve greatness, but rather members of a deliberate organization dedicated to preventing catastrophes that the general population never even knew they faced. This shadow network appears to have operated according to principles that prioritized effectiveness over recognition, understanding that their greatest successes would be disasters that never occurred, heroes who never needed to be celebrated because the threats they faced never materialized. The organization's methods seem to have evolved over time, adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining core principles. During the early eras, when communication was limited and travel dangerous, individual heroes operated with considerable autonomy, guided by shared principles rather than direct coordination. As Tamriel became more connected, the network appears to have developed more sophisticated methods of communication and coordination, allowing for complex operations that spanned multiple provinces and decades. Evidence of this evolution can be found in the increasing sophistication of the operations attributed to forgotten heroes over time. Early figures like Vethrana the Twilight Walker operated as solitary agents, relying on personal abilities and local knowledge. Later, heroes like Sarana Dress demonstrated access to resources and information that would have been impossible for isolated individuals to obtain, suggesting the existence of support networks that provided intelligence, funding, and logistical assistance. The network's influence appears to have peaked during the Second Era, when the chaos of the interregnum created both unprecedented opportunities and extraordinary dangers. During this period, forgotten heroes emerged with remarkable frequency, suggesting either that the organization had expanded significantly or that the circumstances demanded a more visible presence. The coordinated nature of their activities becomes particularly apparent when examining the timeline of their interventions, which often complemented each other in ways that suggest careful planning and communication. Yet for all their apparent organization, these heroes maintained the individual characteristics that made them effective. They possessed an almost supernatural ability to identify the precise moment when intervention was necessary, to recognize which threads in the tapestry of history needed to be cut or strengthened to prevent catastrophic outcomes. This timing was so precise that it suggests either remarkable prescience or access to information sources that remain unknown to modern scholars. The philosophical framework that guided these heroes appears to have been based on principles that modern political theorists would recognize as remarkably sophisticated. They understood that power structures, while often oppressive, also provided stability that prevented even worse outcomes. Their interventions were carefully calibrated to address specific problems without causing systemic collapse that could lead to greater suffering. This nuanced approach is perhaps best exemplified by the work of Matthias the Chronicler, a forgotten hero whose existence is known only through the careful analysis of historical documents that show subtle but consistent alterations. Unlike the forgers and propagandists who crudely manipulated records for personal or political gain, Matthias made surgical changes that preserved the essential truth of events while removing information that could have been used to cause harm. His modifications were so skillful that they remained undetected for centuries, only becoming apparent when modern scholars began using magical techniques to analyze the age and authenticity of different portions of historical texts. The pattern of alterations reveals a mind that understood not just the immediate implications of information, but its potential consequences across multiple generations. The documents that Matthias altered typically contained information about dangerous magical techniques, the locations of powerful artifacts, or the true identities of individuals who needed protection. In each case, he preserved enough information to maintain historical accuracy while removing the specific details that could enable misuse. The result was a historical record that remained fundamentally truthful while being stripped of its most dangerous elements. The scope of Matthias's work was staggering. Analysis suggests that he spent decades, possibly his entire adult life, systematically reviewing and modifying historical documents across multiple provinces. The logistics of such an undertaking would have required not just exceptional skill, but also access to archives, libraries, and private collections that should have been impossible for any individual to obtain. Yet somehow, Matthias managed to work his way through the accumulated knowledge of centuries, making countless small changes that collectively reshaped the intellectual landscape of Tamriel. His interventions prevented the rediscovery of destructive magics, protected the identities of vulnerable individuals, and ensured that future generations would be spared the consequences of knowledge that was too dangerous to preserve. The psychological profile that emerges from studying Matthias's work reveals an individual of extraordinary patience and self-discipline. The changes he made were so subtle that he could never be certain they would achieve their intended effect. Yet he persisted year after year, trusting that his small interventions would accumulate into meaningful protection for future generations. This level of delayed gratification and long-term thinking suggests either remarkable personal wisdom or training in principles that emphasize collective benefit over individual recognition. The mystery deepens when considering how Matthias acquired the knowledge necessary to identify which information was dangerous and which was safe to preserve. His decisions demonstrate understanding of magical principles, political dynamics, and social psychology that would have required expertise in multiple fields. This suggests either that he was himself a scholar of extraordinary breadth, or that he had access to advisors who provided guidance on these complex decisions. The existence of such advisors points once again to the network theory, suggesting that Matthias was not a lone operator, but part of a larger organization that combined individual expertise into collective wisdom. This organization would have needed to maintain detailed knowledge of magical theory, political history, and social dynamics across multiple provinces and centuries, a task that would have required resources and coordination far beyond what any individual could provide. The network's apparent ability to maintain operational security for such extended periods suggests sophisticated understanding of information management and compartmentalization. Individual heroes like Matthias appear to have been provided with specific guidance and resources while being kept ignorant of the broader organizational structure. This approach would have protected the network from discovery while allowing individual operations to proceed with maximum effectiveness. The philosophical implications of such an organization are profound. If the network theory is correct, then Tamriel's history has been shaped not just by the visible forces of politics, religion, and warfare, but by a shadow organization dedicated to preventing catastrophes that the general population never knew they faced. This raises fundamental questions about the nature of historical agency and the relationship between individual choice and collective destiny. The organization's apparent longevity suggests that it possessed methods for preserving institutional knowledge and maintaining operational continuity across generations. This would have required not just careful record-keeping, but also systems for identifying, training, and integrating new members, while maintaining security and operational effectiveness. The sophistication of such systems implies a level of organizational development that rivals that of major political and religious institutions. Yet unlike these visible institutions, the network appears to have operated without the traditional markers of organizational success. There were no grand buildings, no public ceremonies, no official recognition of achievements. The only evidence of their existence lies in the subtle traces they left behind, the disasters that never occurred, and the heroes who faded into obscurity after completing their missions. This paradox of influence without recognition suggests that the network's founders understood something profound about the nature of power and its proper use. They recognized that the most effective interventions are often those that remain invisible, that the greatest victories are those that prevent conflicts rather than winning them, and that the most valuable heroes are those who ensure that their services are never needed. The decline of the network, if indeed it has declined, appears to have been gradual rather than sudden. The frequency of forgotten heroes decreased noticeably after the end of the Third Era, suggesting either that the organization disbanded or that it adapted its methods to become even more subtle. Some scholars speculate that the network still exists, but has evolved beyond the need for individual heroes, instead working through institutions, information networks, and social movements that achieve their goals through collective action rather than individual intervention. The possibility that the network continues to operate in modified form is both reassuring and unsettling. Reassuring, because it suggests that Tamriel continues to be protected from threats that conventional authorities cannot address. Unsettling because it raises questions about agency, democracy, and the right of any organization, however well-intentioned, to shape history from the shadows. These philosophical concerns become particularly acute when considering the network's apparent ability to identify and neutralize threats before they became widely recognized. This prescience suggests either remarkable analytical capabilities or access to information sources that remain unknown to conventional scholars. The possibility that the network possessed or developed predictive capabilities that exceeded those of established institutions raises questions about the nature of knowledge itself and the relationship between information and power. The legacy of these forgotten heroes extends far beyond their individual achievements to encompass the very possibility of heroism itself. They demonstrated that meaningful change could be achieved without recognition, that justice could be served without public acclaim, and that the greatest victories were often those that remained invisible to history. Their example challenges conventional understanding of motivation, suggesting that human beings are capable of sustained effort toward goals that offer no personal benefit beyond the satisfaction of knowing that good has been done. This model of heroism offers hope for every generation that faces seemingly insurmountable challenges. It suggests that individual actions, however small they may seem, can have profound consequences when guided by wisdom and sustained by commitment. The forgotten heroes of Tamriel remind us that history is not merely the record of what has happened, but the cumulative result of countless choices made by individuals who chose to act when action was needed, regardless of whether their efforts would be remembered or recognized. The study of these forgotten heroes also reveals the limitations of conventional historical methodology. Traditional approaches to historical research focus on documented events, recorded decisions, and visible outcomes. Yet the most significant influences on historical development may be precisely those that left no trace. The disasters that were prevented, the conflicts that were avoided, and the heroes who succeeded so completely that their interventions became invisible. This suggests the need for new approaches to historical analysis that can identify and study the spaces between documented events, the silences in the historical record that may indicate not absence, but rather the presence of influences too subtle or too successful to leave obvious traces. Such approaches would require sophisticated understanding of systems thinking, probability analysis, and the complex relationships between individual actions and collective outcomes. The forgotten heroes of Tamriel represent more than just interesting historical curiosities. They embody principles of service, sacrifice, and wisdom that remain relevant to contemporary challenges. Their stories remind us that the most profound changes often begin with individuals who choose to act, not because they expect recognition, but because they recognize that action is necessary. They demonstrate that heroism is not a matter of extraordinary abilities or favorable circumstances, but of ordinary people who choose to do extraordinary things when the situation demands it. In a world increasingly dominated by visible displays of power and public demonstrations of achievement, the forgotten heroes offer an alternative model of effectiveness based on subtlety, patience, and long-term thinking. They succeeded not by overwhelming opposition, but by understanding it, not by demanding attention, but by working in silence, not by seeking immediate gratification, but by trusting that their efforts would bear fruit in ways they might never see. Their legacy challenges us to reconsider our own relationship to recognition and achievement. In an age of social media and instant communication, when every action seems to demand immediate acknowledgement and every achievement requires public celebration, the forgotten heroes remind us that the most meaningful work often occurs in shadows and silence. They suggest that true fulfillment comes not from external validation, but from the internal satisfaction of knowing that one has contributed to something larger than oneself. The stories of these forgotten heroes continue to emerge as scholars develop new methods for analyzing the historical record and new technologies for uncovering hidden patterns in seemingly random events. Each discovery adds another piece to the puzzle of how individual actions shape collective destiny, how small choices accumulate into large consequences, and how the most important heroes are often those whose names are never spoken, but whose influence echoes through the ages. As we continue to uncover these hidden histories, we gain not just knowledge of the past, but wisdom for the future. The forgotten heroes of Tamriel teach us that every generation faces challenges that seem insurmountable, that every era produces individuals who choose to act when action is needed, and that the most profound changes often begin with a single person who decides that the current situation is unacceptable and that something must be done, regardless of the personal cost or the likelihood of recognition. Their example reminds us that heroism is not a rare quality possessed by a chosen few, but a potential that exists within every individual who chooses to act with courage, wisdom, and selfless dedication to the common good. In this sense, the forgotten heroes of Tamriel are not just historical figures, but models for contemporary action, examples of what becomes possible when individuals choose to serve something greater than themselves and to work toward goals that transcend their own immediate interests. The continuing discovery of these hidden histories suggests that the full story of Tamriel's development has yet to be told, that beneath the visible surface of documented events lies a deeper narrative of individual choice, collective action, and the complex interplay between personal decision and historical consequence. As we continue to uncover these stories, we gain not just knowledge of what was, but insight into what might be, and inspiration for what should be. The forgotten heroes of Tamriel stand as testament to a profound truth that echoes through the ages, that the most meaningful acts of courage often unfold in silence, their impact rippling through time in ways that transcend the need for recognition or remembrance. These champions, whose names have been lost to the turning of the Great Wheel, remind us that heroism is not defined by the songs that celebrate it, but by the quiet moments when ordinary individuals choose to become something extraordinary. Their stories reveal patterns that speak to the very nature of heroism itself. Each emerged not from prophecy or divine mandate, but from the simple recognition that action was needed and that they were positioned to provide it. They possessed no special birthright, no ancient bloodline, no mystical calling, only the courage to act when others would not, the wisdom to see what others could not, and the determination to persist when others would have surrendered. The mechanisms by which these heroes operated share remarkable consistency across cultures and centuries. They understood that lasting change required patience, that effective intervention demanded precise timing, and that the greatest victories were often those that prevented conflicts rather than winning them. They worked within existing systems when possible, circumvented them when necessary, and created new ones when neither option sufficed. Their methods evolved with the changing times, adapting to new technologies, shifting political landscapes, and emerging threats while maintaining core principles that transcended temporal boundaries. They demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to identify the precise moment when intervention was necessary, to recognize which threads in the tapestry of history needed to be cut or strengthened to prevent catastrophic outcomes. The philosophical framework that guided these heroes reflects a sophisticated understanding of power, responsibility, and the relationship between individual action and collective consequence. They recognized that true strength lay not in the ability to dominate others, but in the wisdom to know when to act and when to refrain from action. They understood that the most profound changes often required the lightest touch, that the greatest influence was frequently exercised through indirect means, and that the most valuable victories were those that remained invisible to history. The legacy of these forgotten champions extends far beyond their individual achievements to encompass the very possibility of meaningful action in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. They demonstrated that change was possible even when conventional wisdom suggested otherwise, that justice could be served even when the powerful seemed untouchable, and that hope could be maintained even in the darkest of times. Their example challenges contemporary assumptions about motivation, achievement, and the nature of success itself. In an age increasingly dominated by visible displays of power and public demonstrations of accomplishment, these heroes offer an alternative model of effectiveness based on subtlety, patience, and long-term thinking. They succeeded not by overwhelming opposition, but by understanding it, not by demanding attention, but by working in silence, not by seeking immediate gratification, but by trusting that their efforts would bear fruit in ways they might never witness. The continuing discovery of these hidden histories suggests that our understanding of Tamriel's development remains incomplete, that beneath the visible surface of documented events lies a deeper narrative of individual choice, collective action, and the complex interplay between personal decision and historical consequence. Each new revelation adds another piece to the puzzle of how small actions accumulate into large changes, how individual courage can reshape the destiny of nations, and how the most important heroes are often those whose names are never spoken, but whose influence echoes through the ages. As we drift toward the realm of dreams, carried by the gentle current of these timeless tales, We carry with us the knowledge that heroism is not a rare quality possessed by a chosen few, but a potential that exists within every soul who chooses to act with courage, wisdom, and selfless dedication to something greater than themselves. The forgotten heroes of Tamriel remind us that every generation faces challenges that seem insurmountable, that every era produces individuals who choose to act when action is needed, and that the most profound changes often begin with a single person who decides that the current situation is unacceptable and that something must be done. Their stories continue to unfold in the quiet moments between sleeping and waking, in the spaces where memory and imagination converge, in the eternal dance between what was, what is, and what might yet be. They whisper to us across the centuries, reminding us that true heroism lies not in the seeking of glory, but in the simple act of choosing to serve something greater than oneself, regardless of whether that service will ever be acknowledged or remembered. In the end, these forgotten heroes achieved something far more valuable than immortality in song or stone. They achieved the quiet satisfaction of knowing that they had made a difference, that their actions had meaning, and that the world was better because they had chosen to act. Their legacy lives not in monuments or chronicles, but in the countless small acts of courage that continue to shape the world, performed by ordinary people who choose to become heroes in their own quiet ways. As the gentle embrace of sleep draws us deeper into the realm of dreams, we carry with us the eternal truth that heroism is not about being remembered, but about choosing to act with courage and compassion when such action is needed. The forgotten heroes of Tamriel have shown us the way, and their example continues to inspire new generations of quiet champions who understand that the greatest victories are often those that remain hidden. The most meaningful acts are those performed in silence, and the truest heroes are those who ask for nothing more than the opportunity to serve. The vast libraries of the Crystal Tower once held records that spoke of convergences, moments when the forgotten heroes of different eras seemed to work in harmony across the barriers of time itself. These documents, lost when the tower fell, described patterns that suggested the existence of what scholars termed temporal echoes, ripples in the fabric of history that allowed the actions of one hero to influence and guide the efforts of another, separated by centuries. The mechanism behind these temporal echoes remains poorly understood, yet their effects appear throughout the historical record. The techniques developed by Vethrana the Twilight Walker in the early settlement period of Morrowind would later manifest in the methods employed by dream speakers during the Interregnum, despite no apparent connection between the two eras. The organizational principles that guided Sir Aldric Ravencrest's military campaigns in High Rock would resurface in the tactical innovations of commanders who had never heard his name or studied his writings. These patterns suggest that the influence of the forgotten heroes extends beyond their immediate historical context, creating templates of action and thought that persist across generations. The knowledge they developed, the techniques they pioneered, and the philosophical frameworks they established seem to propagate through subtle channels that operate outside conventional methods of cultural transmission. Ideas appear to emerge spontaneously in the minds of individuals who face similar challenges, as if the solutions discovered by earlier heroes leave impressions upon the very structure of reality itself. The phenomenon becomes particularly evident when examining the careers of heroes who operated in geographical regions where previous forgotten champions had worked. The swamplands of Black Marsh, where scales like Midnight had waged his shadow war against imperial occupation, produced an unusual number of resistance fighters in subsequent centuries, each displaying tactical innovations that bore striking resemblances to the Shadowscale's methods. The mountainous regions of Skyrim, where Thora Ironwill had organized her slave rebellion, continued to generate leaders who understood the principles of psychological warfare and popular mobilization with remarkable consistency. These geographical concentrations of heroic activity suggest that certain locations may serve as focal points for the transmission of heroic knowledge and inspiration. The specific sites where great deeds were performed seem to retain something of their champion's essence, creating what mystics term consecrated ground, where future heroes can draw upon the accumulated wisdom of their predecessors. The phenomenon transcends simple cultural memory or oral tradition, operating through channels that connect directly to the consciousness of those who walk the same paths and face similar challenges. The implications of this temporal connectivity extend beyond mere historical curiosity to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of heroism itself. If the forgotten heroes of the past continue to influence events through these mysterious channels, then their sacrifice and dedication achieve a form of immortality that transcends conventional remembrance. Their contributions become part of the eternal structure of heroic possibility, available to inspire and guide future generations, regardless of whether their names are remembered or their stories preserved. The study of these patterns reveals that the forgotten heroes shared certain characteristics that enabled their influence to propagate across time. They possessed what scholars term archetypal completeness, embodying principles and approaches that addressed fundamental human challenges, rather than merely responding to specific historical circumstances. Their methods were sufficiently universal to remain relevant across different cultures and eras, yet flexible enough to adapt to changing conditions and new threats. The network theory gains additional support from evidence of these temporal echoes, suggesting that the organization of forgotten heroes may have understood and deliberately cultivated these connections across time. The consistency of certain symbols, techniques, and philosophical approaches across centuries of heroic activity implies coordination that extends beyond conventional organizational structures to encompass something approaching a collective consciousness of heroic purpose. This collective consciousness appears to operate through what mystics call the dreaming mind, the shared unconscious that connects all living beings through channels that exist outside normal spatial and temporal boundaries. The forgotten heroes, through their profound dedication and sacrifice, may have impressed their essential qualities upon this collective unconscious, creating permanent resources that future heroes can access through intuition, inspiration, and the mysterious processes of creative insight. The mechanism by which this transmission occurs remains one of the great mysteries of Tamrielic metaphysics. Some scholars propose that consciousness itself possesses temporal properties that allow particularly intense experiences to create lasting impressions upon the fabric of reality. Others suggest that the forgotten heroes achieved such complete identification with their heroic purpose that they became archetypes, eternal patterns, that exist outside the normal flow of time and can manifest through suitable individuals in any era. The most compelling evidence for these theories comes from the documented experiences of contemporary heroes who report receiving guidance from sources they cannot identify. These individuals describe moments of sudden insight, intuitive understanding of complex problems, and access to knowledge they have never consciously acquired. The solutions they discover often bear striking resemblances to techniques developed by forgotten heroes of previous eras, suggesting that the connection between past and present champions operates through channels that bypass normal learning processes. The psychological profiles of individuals who appear to receive this guidance reveal certain common characteristics that align with the qualities exhibited by the forgotten heroes themselves. They demonstrate exceptional empathy, unusual sensitivity to the suffering of others, and an almost compulsive need to act when they perceive injustice or threat. Most significantly, they display a willingness to sacrifice personal advantage for the benefit of others, suggesting that the capacity for selfless service may be a prerequisite for accessing the accumulated wisdom of the forgotten champions. The temporal echoes also appear to operate through what researchers term crisis resonance, the tendency for heroic solutions to manifest most clearly during periods of greatest need. Historical analysis reveals that the influence of forgotten heroes becomes most apparent during times of social upheaval, natural disaster, or existential threat, as if the accumulated wisdom of the past responds to the urgency of present circumstances. This suggests that the network of forgotten heroes may have established not just spatial connections, but temporal ones, creating a system of mutual support that extends across the centuries. The philosophical implications of these temporal connections challenge conventional understanding of individual agency and historical causation. If the forgotten heroes of the past continue to influence events through these mysterious channels, then the distinction between past and present action becomes blurred. The courage displayed by a hero in one era may inspire and enable the courage of a hero in another, creating chains of influence that span millennia and connect individuals who never knew of each other's existence. This interconnectedness suggests that heroism itself may be a collective endeavor, with each act of courage and sacrifice contributing to a growing reservoir of heroic potential that future generations can draw upon. The forgotten heroes, through their willingness to act without recognition or reward, may have created something approaching a heroic commons, a shared resource of wisdom, courage, and inspiration that belongs to all humanity and can be accessed by any individual who demonstrates the qualities necessary to serve the greater good. The study of these patterns also reveals the cyclical nature of heroic necessity, with similar challenges arising in different eras and requiring similar responses from those who choose to address them. The forgotten heroes appear to have recognized this cyclical pattern, developing solutions that remained relevant across multiple iterations of the same fundamental problems. Their approach to these challenges created templates that could be adapted to new circumstances while maintaining their essential effectiveness. The continuing discovery of these hidden connections between past and present heroes suggests that our understanding of historical influence remains incomplete. The visible threads of causation that historians trace through documented events may represent only the surface manifestations of deeper patterns that operate through consciousness itself. The forgotten heroes, through their profound dedication to service over recognition, may have achieved a form of influence that transcends the normal limitations of mortal existence. As we consider the implications of these temporal echoes, we begin to understand that the forgotten heroes of Tamriel achieved something far more profound than temporary solutions to specific problems. They created enduring patterns of heroic action that continue to influence events long after their individual stories have been forgotten. Their legacy lives not in monuments or chronicles, but in the mysterious mechanisms by which courage, wisdom, and selfless dedication propagate through time, inspiring new generations of heroes who carry forward their essential spirit even when their names remain unknown. The forgotten heroes remind us that true heroism transcends the boundaries of individual existence, creating influences that ripple through time in ways that defy conventional understanding. They demonstrate that the most meaningful acts of courage often unfold in silence, their impact rippling through the ages in patterns too subtle for ordinary observation, yet too powerful to be denied. Their stories continue to unfold in the quiet moments between sleeping and waking, in the spaces where memory and imagination converge, in the eternal dance between what was, what is, and what might yet be. In the end, these champions achieved something far more valuable than immortality in song or stone. They achieved the quiet satisfaction of knowing that they had made a difference, that their actions had meaning, and that the world was better because they had chosen to act. Their legacy lives not in monuments or chronicles, but in the countless small acts of courage that continue to shape the world, performed by ordinary people who choose to become heroes in their own quiet ways. Guided by the eternal example of those who came before and inspired by the timeless truth that heroism is not about being remembered, but about choosing to serve something greater than oneself when such service is needed.